I welcome all of you again, for those of you from the Harvard Club and guests and from the MIT Club and guests. Today I think we're really honored and pleased to have our speakers. Their topic is one that, with our demographic as well as what's happening in the world, I think is extremely appropriate. So 2 speakers we have. You heard it as plural. That's correct. So Teresa Amabile is the Edsel Bryant Ford Professor of Business Administration, Emerita at Harvard Business School. Before turning her research interest to the retirement transition, which we'll hear today, she devoted over 40 years of researching creativity and innovation. She was instrumental in establishing the social psychology of creativity, the study of how the social environment can influence creative behavior, primarily by influencing motivation. Her research on creativity appears in her book, Creativity in Context, as well as numerous articles for scholars and practitioners. More recently, she studied how everyday life inside organizations can influence people with their creativity, productivity, commitment, and collegiality by affecting inner work life. And that is the confluence of motivation, emotions, and perception. The findings of this longitudinal research paper in her co-authored book, The Progress Principle, using small wins to ignite joy, engagement, and creativity at work. Her other books include, among others, Growing Up Creative. Teresa's work has appeared in over 100 scholarly journal articles and a variety of other outlets, including Harvard Business Review, as well as several edited books. She has presented her work to audiences in a variety of settings, including Pixar, Genentech, TEDx Atlanta, Apple, TEDx Atlanta, Apple, Pfizer, and the World Economic Forum in Davos. She has served on a number of boards and has received a variety of awards. Among them are the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Management's Organizational Behavior Division, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Israeli Organizational Behavior Conference, an honorary doctorate from BI Norwegian Business School, and the election to the 2024 Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. Now, Lotte Bailyn, our second speaker. She is the T. Wilson Professor of Management Emerita at the MIT Sloan School of Management. For the period of 1997-1999, she was chair of the MIT faculty. Oh, I don't envy you that. And during 1995-97, she was the Martina Horner Distinguished Visiting Professor at Radcliffe's Public Policy Institute. She studies the intersection between work and family life and explores organizational practices meant to reconcile the demands of both. In Breaking the Mold, Women, Men, and Time in the New Corporate World, she made the argument that efforts to redesign organizations to succeed in an intensely competitive world will fail unless its architects take into account the changing nature of the workforce, the significant entry of women, and the consequent changes in lifestyles for both men and women. Her attempts, along with colleagues, to make organizations change that, meet the dual agenda of gender equity and work effectiveness are detailed in the updated revised edition of her book, Breaking the Mold, Redesigning Work for Productive and Satisfying Lives, as well as in Beyond Work, Family Balance, Advancing Gender Equity and Workplace Performance, 2 books. She is the co-author of that last one. Among her awards are the Everett Sherrington Hughes Award for Career Scholarship and the Scholar Practitioner Award from the Academy of the Management, the 221 Centennial Medal from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and 3 honorary degrees, the last from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So with the remainder of time that we have, excellent, I would like to bring our speaker up. Teresa.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Roger. Lotte and I are delighted to be here, sharing some of the main findings from our recently completed research on the retirement transition. And we did this research with our co-authors and colleagues and good friends, Marcy Crary on the far left. Marcy's at Bentley University. We are now all retired emeritus professors. Marcy's from Bentley, and on the far right, Tim Hall and Kathy Cram are from Boston University. And that's Lottie in the middle. In case you haven't seen her yet, you will see her during the Q&A. She's right here. And that's me with them. And that is one of our many delightful team dinners that we've had over the 10 years plus now that we've been working together. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to remember the first thing that pops into your head: retirement. We asked that question of all 120 people that we interviewed in this 10 years of research that we did. I'm going to show you a word cloud of the things that popped into the heads of the older professionals in the study. These are people age 55 plus who are still working. Now maybe you see your word up there, maybe you don't, but I'll tell you what leapt out at me the first time I saw this word cloud. Scary, never, far away, unknown. One person told us that facing retirement was like standing at the edge of a cliff staring into a void. Well, sure, there were some positive associations. We have freedom, possibilities, relaxation, but not as many positive associations. And look how small fun is. Why were they so scared? Well, it's not because they were financially insecure. These were all knowledge workers, some high-level managers, working in successful U.S. companies. And we only selected volunteers who said that they were at least reasonably financially secure and reasonably healthy. I was really surprised and disturbed by this level of dread that people seem to have about retiring. My aim with this talk, and actually our aim with our book, is to give insight into the experience of retiring, show how it can be navigated, and relieve the fear. So whether you're confronting retirement yourself, close to someone who's confronting it, or leading an organization from which people retire, I hope that you'll find value in the lessons of our research. And in fact, we believe that many of the lessons of this research apply equally well to other life transitions apart from retiring, like getting elected to your town council, or getting a new grandchild, or losing your election to the town council, or even losing a spouse. So I hope that these findings of our research will give you insight and give you value to help you in all of your life transitions. I'm going to interweave the lessons of our research in with the stories of two of our stars. Our stars are the 14 people that we followed from the final months of their career into the first few years of retirement. These two stars we're going to feature here today we call Irene and Lawrence. Irene and Lawrence have a lot in common. They both had long, successful careers at prestigious U.S. companies. They were both about age 60 when we first interviewed them, and their stories encapsulate the major discoveries of our research. But despite those commonalities, it's actually the differences between Lawrence and Irene that make their stories so powerful. 1 year into retirement, Irene could hardly have been more satisfied with her life. But Lawrence's life was spiraling out of control. He was facing severe alcoholism and the prospect of never seeing his grandchildren again. His story is extreme for sure, but it does highlight the risks and the potentially traumatic consequences of entering retirement without a clear sense of who you are and what your day-to-day retirement life might look like. When we analyzed the 200 plus interviews that we created in this data collection, And that includes over 100 interviews with the 14 stars. We derived our first lesson. And that is that it takes work to stop working. The work can be enjoyable, certainly, but it does take time and energy and attention to go from a relatively stable, well-established working life to a satisfying retirement life. Fortunately, we saw many different pathways in the stories of the people that we interviewed. We saw many different pathways to a satisfying retirement life. So that means there is no single best way to do it. We did see some bad ways to do it, though, and you'll get a little insight into that. So the tasks, the 4 tasks are, first, deciding to retire. Second task is detaching from work. The third is experimenting and exploring in order to build a provisional retirement life. And finally, consolidating a more or less stable retirement life from those provisional elements. The tasks don't always happen in the sequence, and sometimes people will continue working on one task even after they've finished a supposedly later task. But everyone in the US who retires does have to confront these 4 tasks and the challenges that they can bring. So when we analyze all of the interviews from the older people in our study, and that is the people who were 55 plus and still working, and the people who were already retired when we interviewed them, we noticed that organizations could have a really significant impact on people's experience of retiring, especially in the earlier phases of this process. And that's the second lesson. We saw, for example, that if people have creative assignments, that is, assignments calling for creativity, in the final years of their career, they're more likely to be satisfied with their retirement life. And you know, people do need help with financial planning for retirement, and most companies offer programs on financial planning. But people also need programs on the issues that we focused on in our research, the psychological and relational and life restructuring issues surrounding retirement. One of the companies from which we recruited participants had a transition to retirement program whereby professionals could sign a contract to retire in 18 months, work 3 days a week for those 18 months, get paid for 4 days a week, and enjoy their full benefits. Employees loved this program, but it really helped the organization too, because it enabled them to better plan staffing and succession. When a company has a good knowledge transfer mechanism, when someone's retiring, of course that person's colleagues benefit, and so does the organization, but it turns out that the retiring person benefits as well, because they feel valued right up to their very last day. Most companies have some sort of retirement ritual, a party maybe, or a scrapbook of messages from colleagues, or a gift from the CEO. We saw that those kinds of rituals can really mean a lot to people. And we saw a number of interesting programs for retirees in the early years of their retirement. Things like a newsletter, a social media group, parties sponsored by the company, part-time contract work opportunities. And you know, even just calling them alumni rather than retirees replaces a negative stereotype with a positive one. So we're going to take a look at the place of Irene's organization in her life pre-retirement. We're going to look at this in the form of a life map that she drew at our request to depict her life pre-retirement. Now you can see that her company, her work, looms very large in her life. It's the biggest circle, it takes up the most space, it is her central context. And because of some organizational changes, work had become kind of an uphill battle in recent years for Irene and her team. But notice, she has a lot of other things going on in her life. She's got family and friends, many activities that she enjoys doing throughout the year. Although she did tell us, Lotte was Irene's interviewer, she told Lotte that she had less time than she wanted for connecting with many of her friends, and she had less time than she wanted for a number of other activities. And here is Lawrence's pre-retirement life map. For him also, family was very important. But interestingly, work is a lot less important for Lawrence at this point, shortly before he retired, than it had been even a few years before that. So when Lawrence and his wife were 30 years old, they decided that they wanted to retire when they were 60. And they managed their family finances during all those years to be able to meet that goal. And when Lawrence saw that financial target coming into view when he was in his late 50s, his work became increasingly less important to him. Irene had her most difficult time during her retirement transition with the very first task, and that was making the decision. She loved her team and she respected her company, but work had become more of a drag in recent years. It was more stressful. It was sapping her energy more than it had before. And there were many, many other things that she wanted to do with her time. She was feeling drawn to other things. And yet for 4 years, she went back and forth on the decision. She would decide, okay, I'm going to retire this year. And then she'd push it out a year. And she was kind of frustrated with herself. And she kept asking herself, well, why don't you just retire? And in one interview, she felt like she had found an important reason why it was so tough for her. People do respect you while you're still working. And after, maybe not so much. So for Irene, it was an identity issue. And we found that for many people, identity issues can loom very large, especially in the early phases of this process. And that's certainly true for the task of detaching from work, especially people who identified strongly with their work during their careers can encounter 3 psychological stumbling blocks. The first is that loss of professional identity. The second is loss of professional relationships. And the third is the loss of that daily and weekly, monthly, annual rhythm and routine by which your work structures your life. We saw people taking many different creative approaches to dealing with these stumbling blocks. But the stumbling blocks are real. And it can be hard to see that there are ways of managing them when you're standing on the edge of that retirement cliff. So how did Lawrence and Irene do with the second task of retiring? Well, given Lawrence's 30-year plan, we thought he'd have a pretty easy time of it, and he did. And given how tough Irene found that first task, we thought she would struggle as well with the second task. But no, she didn't. They both said something like this about their last day at work. I walked away and never looked back. So why was it so easy for Irene to detach from her work? It's because of the smooth dance that she managed between herself and her life structure. So these are 2 key concepts Yourself is just everything important about you as you see yourself, and your life structure is everything important about your life. Of course, we all have a self and a life structure all the time, whether or not we think about them. And they can both change over time. And what we observe during the retirement transition is that there is a constant interplay between these two. They exert mutual influence on each other. I have a figure showing that. So this is yourself and your life structure. And we also have to take into account, of course, the external context, the outside world, outside of self and life structure, which can impact both. Just remember how we were all affected, and so were our lives during that first year of the COVID pandemic. So throughout the retirement transition, people seem to be constantly, though implicitly or unconsciously, assessing how satisfactory their life structure is on two key dimensions. So this is a bonus lesson. These are the two key dimensions of how satisfactory a life structure is. The first is its suitability for the self, how well it fits the self. And the second is its viability, how sustainable it is for the longer term. We found that when people perceive that the life structure isn't quite satisfactory, that it's not suitable for the self, it's not viable, they will make a move on the life structure. And that means changing something, either a minor tweak, maybe in just one context, all the way up to major changes in multiple contexts. But at the same time, the life structure is affecting the self, even possibly sometimes changing aspects of the person's identity. And that impact occurs because of what has changed in the life structure, either because of the change you made in the life structure, or because of some dynamics going on in the life structure over which you have no control. But the mutual influence goes on and on and on. And this is the back and forth dance that Irene managed so well, and why she was able to detach from her work so easily. Okay, so I'm now going to give you an opportunity to focus on yourself and your life structure for a few minutes. I have an exercise. There's paper and pencils on the tables, and everybody needs a sheet of paper and a pencil. If you'd rather use pen and you have one with you, you can take that out. And you might want to clear away some space on the table for yourself to write or draw. I want to stress that what you're doing is completely confidential. You need not ever show anything that you're writing or drawing to anyone else. You may if you want, but that's not going to be part of the exercise. You're not going to have to show it to anyone. So first, work on the top 1/3 or 1/4 of the page and write a few words that you feel capture who you are, the core of your self. And here are examples of the kinds of things you might write. Your identities, your roles, values, needs, priorities. Just a few words that capture the core pieces of how you view yourself. All right, now on the next slide, you'll see part 2 of this exercise, which maybe you saw this coming. It's to draw a life map of your current life. Use the remaining space that you have on the page to do that. And try to include all the important contexts in your current life. Activities, relationships, places where you spend your time, organizations and groups you belong to. Don't forget the club. And use, as Irene did and Lawrence, use size of elements and placement, and you can use arrows or lines of other kinds to depict the relative importance of these contexts and how they interrelate. So I'll ask you to take maybe 5 to 7 minutes to sketch out the broad outlines of your current life map. Okay, final part of this is to consider your current life structure, as shown in the life map you just drew, on those 2 key dimensions of how satisfactory it is, how suitable it is for yourself as you are now. And look at those self words that you wrote at the top of the page. And how viable is it for the longer term, or at least for the foreseeable future? Suitability and viability. And you might want to consider what you might need to change in your life structure or even yourself to improve suitability and viability. So I'll give you just a minute or 2 to kind of think about that, jot down some notes for yourself. Okay, I'm going to give you at your table about 2 minutes to talk to someone next to you about an insight that you got from doing this exercise, or a question you have about the exercise. And I'm hoping that we can discuss some of those insights and questions during the Q&A. So just a couple of minutes, pick a partner, and if there's an odd number of people at your table, maybe 3 of you can speak with each other, and just let everybody have a chance to say what insight they got from this. Okay, why don't we cut the conversation short at this time? And I'm hoping that maybe you can continue these conversations after we finish the formal program here. And I did see some people sharing their life maps, which was interesting to me. Sometimes some people feel very private about their life map or their self-words, and others would like to share and get some feedback from others. And you might want to try this exercise with people at home. It can be very enlightening. Lotte and I have found that. We've done it in our research group. So this exercise leads us to the next lesson, which is all about alignment. Alignment is the degree of fit between yourself and your life structure. And we found that people tend to have a smoother transition into a satisfying retirement life if they can maintain good alignment between self and life structure throughout each of the 4 tasks. So if you remember Irene's pre-retirement life structure, she had good alignment between self and life structure in many aspects. But there were other aspects of her life structure that did not align so well. So after 4 years going around and around on this decision, Irene finally realized that the fit just wasn't good enough, that life structure wasn't working for her anymore. So she made 2 big moves. The first one was to remove company by retiring, and the second was to make a geographical move. She and her husband Daniel moved to their vacation home on nearby Cape Cod, a home that they had always planned to renovate as their home for their retirement life. So they made that geographical move as well. And it was in making those moves that Irene was able to achieve better alignment between self and life structure. But she could only do that because she had developed a keen awareness of her current self, what her current needs and priorities and values were, what her current identities that were most important to her were. And she realized that that life structure, which included that huge company bubble, just didn't suit who she had become. And because it was wearing her out so much, it really wasn't viable for the longer term. Awareness is the second A. So alignment is the first of 4 A words that you're going to be seeing. And awareness is the second. Unfortunately, Lawrence lacked Irene's degree of awareness about self and life structure, as he later admitted to himself and to me. He and his wife Cynthia had decided that immediately upon retiring, they would move to an unfamiliar city 1,000 miles away, Savannah, Georgia, where they knew no one except the 3 people they were related to: their younger son, their daughter-in-law, and the toddler grandson that Lawrence referred to as the center of our world. Unfortunately, even though they were planning on more or less restructuring their lives around that little family, it seems that they never had a deep, honest conversation with them in advance about what the benefits and pitfalls of living so close together in the same city might be. And once they did move, Lawrence lacked awareness of what his drinking was doing to himself and his relationship, and the consequences were dire. The next A, the next lesson, comes from another contrast between Irene and Lawrence. Agency is about proactively changing something about your life structure or about yourself to achieve better alignment. And Irene exercised loads of agency in ending her career, moving to the Cape. She oversaw the renovation because Daniel was still working. He planned to work for a few more years. And she began to experiment and explore other activities, groups to join on the Cape, new relationships, as she was building that provisional retirement life, the third task of the transition. Lawrence's downfall was that he didn't exercise agency in building a new life for himself in Savannah. And when things weren't working out as he had envisioned, he couldn't adapt. And adaptability is the final lesson, the 4th A. So as soon as Lawrence had settled into his new home in Savannah, after they'd moved in, he didn't exercise agency in doing this third task. He really avoided it. In fact, there were many things that he had talked about doing pre-retirement, like volunteering with Habitat for Humanity or teaching a project management course at a local college. But the only thing that he did regularly was some part-time babysitting for his grandson. That and drinking a lot with Cynthia. And unfortunately, a few months after Lawrence retired, to his shock, his son and daughter-in-law separated with great acrimony and eventually divorced. And this severely restricted the access that Lawrence had to what he had called the center of his world. And faced with this crisis, he couldn't adapt. He and Cynthia sank deeper into alcoholism and a really unhappy state of inertia until both of their sons confronted them and told them that unless they got sober and stayed sober, they would never see their grandchildren again. That was the turning point. They came out of long-term residential rehab several months later, and as Lawrence put it, he did a complete 180 in his view of himself and his life. I last heard from him a few months ago, and he told me, to my delight, They were still sober 6 years later, happily engaged with family and friends and the recovery community in Savannah, and celebrating their 50th anniversary. So Lawrence had finally taken care of not only task 3, but task 4. He had consolidated a quasi-stable retirement life. And we say quasi-stable because, as you know, things always change eventually. So Lawrence, with his wife Irene, and with his wife Cynthia, and Irene with her husband Daniel, had both settled into happily, satisfyingly suitable and viable retirement lives. It just took Lawrence a lot longer to get there. I'm going to show you their consolidated life maps. For Lawrence, this is 5 years into retiring, and for Irene, it's just 1 year. When I interviewed Lawrence to discuss this life map, he pointed out to me sobriety, which is surrounding everything in his life, and he said it's really what enables and holds together all of the elements of his life really beautifully. He still doesn't have as much going on in his life as Irene has in hers, but that's all right. This is the life that works for him. So was Irene really that much better in how she approached retirement than Lawrence was? Or was she just lucky? Well, yeah, she was lucky not to have a family crisis like he did early in retirement. But the fact is, early in her retirement, she got a shocking cancer diagnosis. But because she had developed that awareness and agency in building her retirement life, she was able to adapt to this completely unwelcome thing coming at her. And she was able to weather that storm. Of course, with immense support from this beautiful constellation of family and friends that she had built up around herself. And yeah, Lawrence really was unlucky to have his son and daughter-in-law separate and for it to be so acrimonious, and she didn't want him to spend time with the little boy. That was really unlucky. But the fact is, during his first 2 years of retirement, he did not exercise the 4 A's nearly to the extent that he could have. So he did make it, but it took a long time. The consequence for him was a really turbulent transition and a long delay in creating that satisfying retirement life. So here are your takeaways. Retiring takes work, and there's no one right way to do it. Organizations can have an outsized impact on the experience. And if you can achieve alignment between self and life structure by developing a deep awareness of both and exercising both agency and adaptability as called for by your life circumstances, you'll give yourself a good chance of creating a retirement life that works for you. And if that doesn't sufficiently relieve your fear, I'm going to show you now a word cloud of the word associations to the word retirement by the people who were already retired when we interviewed them and asked them that question. It's all good stuff. And look how big fun is. And if that doesn't make you optimistic enough, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to really end with this uplifting quote from Irene. She said this a few years after retiring. "Sometimes I still wish I had done it earlier, sooner. Retirement is kind of wasted on the older, completely wasted. Having that time to just pursue what you want to pursue is really great. I'm just really enjoying my life. Even the humdrum stuff, it can be satisfying." That surprised me. So thank you very much, and Lotte and I will be happy to take your questions. Yes?
Do you feel your findings align with Waldinger and the Harvard Life Study of the people they studied since the 30s?
Yes, the question was about Robert Waldinger and the Harvard study of adult development. Yes, and the main lesson, I think there are many lessons of Waldinger's research, and of course, Waldinger is only the most recent custodian of the Harvard life study of adult development. They started studying this. Original data collectors started studying people probably 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, and they've continued following them and following their descendants also since then, and adding new groups to the study. The main finding, as I conceive of it, and we actually had Bob Waldinger come to our research team and discuss his findings and our findings together, is that relationships are absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And you saw that in Irene's story, certainly, and in Lawrence's story. First in a negative way, and then in a very positive way. So I would say our findings are really consonant with his. Well, what do you think, Larry?
No, well, we did a more
You have to hold it really close to your mouth.
we did a more micro study of the actual transition. His is much longer term, going over a much longer period. So it's our results certainly don't contradict in any way, but in this micro understanding of a process at a particular transition, you get a little bit more details about that while you're losing the big scope that the Harvard study has. But there's no contradiction in any way. It's a different level of analysis.
We interviewed our people every few months throughout most of the time we followed them, and the Waldinger study follows up with people every few years. So we just, yeah, as Lottie said, a more micro view. Other questions? Yeah.
New relationships, old relationships. Is there a value to either one of those or any one of those?
I didn't get it.
Yeah, the question was, what is it about relationships? Is it how many you have? Is it the quality of the relationships?
It really has to do with whether the relationships are part of your life structure and whether that amount and who they are fits your particular self-needs. Are you the kind of person who likes to have one or two deep friends? And that's really satisfactory for you. Then if you have those one or two, that's fine. Someone else might feel that they're much more extroverted and want a large group, and then it's a question whether in their life they have that large group. So as in many of these results, they're very big individual differences, but the key is whether what you need from yourself fits what's available for you in your life.
Absolutely, and I would just add one thing. We found that there were certain relationships that our colleagues, Marcy and Tim and Kathy, call high-quality relationships. And those tended to be relationships where people had not only personal interactions, but they also had activities that they shared. Maybe they worked together, or they volunteered together, or they enjoyed traveling together, but there were activities that bound them together, as well as just, conversations and sharing things about themselves. And I think I saw a question here before. Yeah.
In my experience,
Let me give you the mic.
In my experience, I think women tend to retire more happily with more interests and, I don't know, live longer. And I was attributed to the social aspects of women and maybe, and I don't know if any of that's borne out in any of your studies.
I didn't.
So the question is, do women have a better time of it in retiring than men? It is true that women tend to live longer than men. And that's sort of a well-established finding, I think, across cultures even. But do women have an easier time of retiring, more activities?
Well, I think we didn't study specifically. We have anecdotal. But women have an easier fallback into family roles because they've been used to that more ways. So for men, more often, the work is their whole life while they're employed. And that's much less likely to be true for women. Whether this new generation coming up, that will change, that's possible. But certainly the people that we did, there was an easier fallback for women to, when the work, even if they loved it and were very involved in it, when that's gone, they had family issues to attend to, which makes it easier.
Say that last thing again, please.
You want to hear the last thing that she said?
Yes.
Do you remember what it was like?
I was saying that women once work is gone, even if they were very involved in it, have family roles more easily to fall back to give some structure and some meaning to their lives.
Thank you.
Roger?
Yes, the successful aging research has purpose as a huge part of being successful. I don't think there's any contradiction there with the research you've given us. But did that term come up very often with you?
The term purpose. No, it didn't. There were people in the interviews who would talk about, I need to find my purpose, but not as much as we thought we'd see. Yeah.
What actually happened is that there was a tendency to say, as they were anticipating retirement, they want to do something meaningful, purposeful. They want to give back. But then 4 or 5 years later, they learn to enjoy the everyday living, and they began to shift from a meaningful purpose to, well, I'll do a hobby, I'll do something. Yes.
And we did find individual differences. In fact, there's a paper that one of our doctoral students who worked on this project published with me as a co-author a couple of years ago. His name is Jeff Steiner. And we found that there are people during working life and during retirement, there are sort of 4 types in terms of how you view life. And there's the type, and this is about 25% of people, who view life as an overall story that should have a theme, a meaningful purpose. And life is in chapters. And it's like a bird's eye view of life. There's the on-the-ground view of life, which is the day-by-day experience, and focusing on the quality of that day-by-day experience without necessarily one theme or a meaningful purpose flowing through it. And then there are people who hold both, and they kind of switch back and forth between the two. Both are important to them. And then there are people who are so busy fighting fires in the trenches that they're not really thinking about life at all. And what we found is that, as Lotte said, people who have a certain view of life while they're working can carry that view of life through into retirement. But then it can change. 3, 4, 5 years down the road into retirement, a person who was all about meaning and purpose is now starting to focus a little bit more on the day-by-day quality of life. And the person who was more quality of life, day-by-day experience, those people will often start to think about, okay, what is the bigger purpose here? What is the larger meaning? So we find some of the other viewpoint coming in to kind of balance what the person had held before. It's really interesting. Yeah. Other questions? I'm going to come over with the microphone, if that's okay, Iris. Let me hold it for you. I'll be like Oprah.
Oh, yes, all right. So the word cloud at the end was so wonderful and positive. And Lawrence, your example, he made it into that good cloud. So are you suggesting that everybody, whether they're aware or agile or your other A's, everybody eventually gets to be happy in retirement or content in retirement? Are there any failures?
It is not true that everybody gets to be happy in retirement. Our 14 stars, those are the 14 people that we interviewed over and over and over again, all of them did end up in a good place, or at least a pretty good place. But among the others that we interviewed just once, there were a few who were retired and were not doing well.
And then things happen. Like one of our stars, very late, past our last interviews, his wife suddenly died. And, you know, everything is upended.
Oh, Lottie, I did one interview with him shortly after his wife died.
Yeah.
And yeah, his life, he had a nicely
all over.
Yeah, he had a nicely consolidated retirement life, and he said now everything is up in the air. Yeah, so it's not true that everyone was happy, but most were. Most did have, I think, really satisfying stories in the end. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering if some people unretire as a way to cope with not having good retirement. What does your research show?
Did we have people who unretired, who stopped working and then went back and found a job, or?
Well, we had people who continued with some contract work with their companies, and there are some laws that made that a 6 months division before you could do that. So we certainly had people who did work for pay again in retirement. But it was very different, usually quite different kinds of jobs, except for those who continued contract work with their companies. And they found that because they didn't have any of the administrative stuff, they could just do the work they wanted to do. So that's very appealing. It's one of the things that organizations can do.
We, of course, only studied people who are at least reasonably financially secure. I know that, certainly in our current economy, there are people who were retired and are now thinking that they need to find some work to supplement their retirement savings. So, Roger, should we wrap up?
Please, and because we want you to be signing books, and that's what.
Thank you. Yeah.